We have a very distinguished group here today, but I wanted to just tell you very briefly how honored we are to be hosting this. Meridian's mission is to strengthen America's ties to the world, and I think it's very fitting, given the fact that we're commemorating this important speech, that you all have selected to do this at Meridian. We've had a lot of very interesting people come through these buildings, which were built by John Russell Pope, who also built the Jefferson Memorial, the National Archives, the National Gallery of Art. I was looking back at the alums, and they included, in 1967, a young or middle-aged member of Parliament from the United Kingdom, Margaret Thatcher, who spent several weeks here. We've also had nearly 2,000 leaders coming through a year from overseas, and again, it's the spirit of President Reagan and his clarion call for freedom and democracy that brings a lot of the people here. So we're delighted, and I'd like to introduce my very good friend, Lauren Craner, the president of IRI, who will introduce the panel. Lauren.
Thank you, Ambassador Holliday. As Stuart noted, he is an IRI alum. We're very proud of his work. Before it was cool in the Middle East, he began our programs in Oman, the West Bank, and Morocco, and I just had the opportunity to visit Oman and see some of your old friends. Thank you so much, Stuart, for making this beautiful facility available for our panel today. I also want to thank a couple of IRI staff, George Foriel, Patricia Lenish, Esther Skelly, who have worked particularly hard on this. You will see other IRI staff here who have worked equally hard. I want to note in particular the presence of Attorney General Meese, who is not only giving our dinner keynote, but has been gracious enough to show up for the panel. He claims he may learn something. I doubt it, but we're very, very happy to have you here. You will also notice taping equipment. We are taping this. I was telling our guests earlier that we now have staff who were born after 1982 who don't quite understand the history of IRI, so we're very, very glad to have them here. We are here today to talk about the events that led to a seminal speech by a true visionary delivered at Westminster, a place he deemed one of democracy's shrines. And it was on that day, 25 years ago this month, when the Soviet Union appeared invincible, that President Reagan asked a simple question: must freedom wither in a quiet, deadening accommodation with totalitarian evil? And we are all thankful that his answer was a resounding no. He framed that answer by adding that America's mission was, as he put it, to preserve freedom as well as peace. It may not be easy to see, he said, but I believe we live now at a turning point. It was a turning point that was, in Margaret Thatcher's memorable words, put freedom on the offensive. 5 years later, in 1987, President Reagan stood in front of the Berlin Wall and asked simply that it be torn down. In those 5 years after President's speech at Westminster, much had been achieved, from conceptualizing the March of Freedom to energizing the way this country assists others in building their democracy. That led to the creation of the National Endowment for Democracy, our institute, IRI, our cousins at the National Democratic Institute, Center for International Private Enterprise, and the Solidarity Center, all of which were founded in 1984. Part of our discussion today will also focus on the future, the continuing evolution of democracy building. IRI's work was initially limited to Latin America. It now reaches some 70 countries around the globe, places like Serbia in the late 90s, places like Georgia and Kyrgyzstan, Ukraine today, not to mention Afghanistan and Iraq. To launch today's discussion, it's my distinct pleasure to introduce Ambassador Richard Williamson, who is a partner of Meyer, Brown, Rowe, and Maw. As many of you know, he was present at the creation of the Westminster speech when he served as President Reagan's Assistant for Intergovernmental Affairs, and then later in the Reagan administration as Ambassador to the UN in Vienna and as Assistant Secretary of State for International Organization Affairs. He returned to the UN again in recent years to serve as ambassador and later as ambassador to the UN Commission on Human Rights. In between his service in government, he's overseen President Reagan's legacy as a longstanding board member of the International Republican Institute. Rich, I turn the proceedings over to you.
Thank you. Thanks, Lauren, very much. Ambassador Holliday, thank you for hosting us in your modest home. Lauren, just want to say that it's been a great honor and privilege to be associated with IRI. I salute our President, Lauren Craner, and our Chairman, Senator John McCain. And I must note a gentleman who was very kind to me and I first got to know in the 1976 Reagan campaign, Ed Meese, who I think I'd first give credit that the one person Ronald Reagan needed to become president was Nancy. But the next two MVPs would be Paul Laxalt and Ed Meese, so it's a great pleasure for him to be here. 5 years ago, at a 20th anniversary of the Westminister speech, Tony Dolan, who had been chief White House speechwriter in the Reagan administration, a man who wrote the first draft of this speech, said, quote, "It was not hard to know what Reagan wanted to say. He'd been saying it for 30 years. And I think that's true, and I'm going to go through a few comments and he made prior to that give meaning to Tony's words. But first, I just want to note I've been reading the Reagan diaries, and I want to read three quick quotes which capture a lot of the Ronald Reagan I knew. The first one was from February 1981. Quote, "Word is that the last 2 weeks of hostage negotiations were completely dominated by Iranian fear. They'd have to negotiate with our administration. I couldn't be happier." The same month, he wrote, "Intelligence reports say Castro is very worried about me. I'm very worried that we can't come up with something to justify his worry." But also part of the lift, and this goes to the speech too, comes from an entry in his diary in March on a trip to New York, which had meaning to me. It was the first time I had the chance to walk out of the West Wing and get on the helicopter and fly to Andrews and all that. But his comments were very interesting. He says, "One thing was unusual and very humbling. The streets were lined with people as if for a parade all the way to the Waldorf. They cheered and clapped. I wore my arms out, waving back to them. I keep thinking that this can't continue, and yet their warmth and affection seems so genuine. I get a lump in my throat. I pray constantly that I won't let them down." And the them, I think, is not only the American people, but the broad audience of those he envisioned to be free. In a radio address in 1976, he said, "At times it has seemed as if the symbol of American power has become our departing ambassador, flag under his arm, boarding a rescue helicopter." Reagan went on to quote from an article by Ferdinand Mount that appeared in the London Daily Mail. He said, "We criticize," Mount wrote, "copy, patronize, idolize, insult, but we never doubt that the United States has a unique position in the history of human hopes. For it is the only nation founded solely on a moral dream. A part of our future is tied up in it, and the greatest of all the gifts Americans have given us is hope." And of course, the Westminster speech was not only about hope, but putting together the mechanisms to try to realize that hope. At a VFW speech in August of 1980, not long before the election, Reagan said, "World peace must be our number one priority, but it must not be peace at any price. Peace must be such that freedom can flourish and justice prevail." Later in that speech, he said, "Our foreign policy should be to show by example the greatness of our system and the strength of American ideals. The truth is, we would like nothing better than to see the Russian people living in freedom and dignity instead of being trapped in the backwash of history as they are." Recently, Andrei Sakharov, one of the Russians' greatest scientists and presently under house arrest, smuggled a statement out of the Gulag. He wrote, "I consider the United States the historically determined leader of the movement toward a pluralist and free society, vital to mankind." He is right. Let's do a better job of exporting Americanism. Let's meet our responsibility to keep the peace at the same time we maintain without compromise our principles and ideals. I believe it is our preordained destiny to show all mankind that they, too, can be free without having to leave their native shore. And of course, at Westminister, Reagan said, among other things, democracy is not a fragile flower. Still, it needs cultivating. If the rest of this century is to witness the gradual growth of freedom and democratic ideals, we must take actions to assist the campaign for democracy, and that, of course, is what these institutions have tried to do. At his farewell address at the Oval Office, Ronald Reagan said, "And to all that time, I want to nickname the great communicator. But I never thought it was my style or the words I used that made a difference. It was the content. I wasn't a great communicator, but I communicated great things. And they didn't spring full-blown from my brow. They came from the heart of a great nation, from our experience, our wisdom, and our belief in the principles that have guided us for 2 centuries. They called it the Reagan Revolution. Well, I'll accept that. But for me, it always seemed more like the great rediscovery, a rediscovery of our values and our common sense." In 1999, Lauren and I were at a conference in Gdansk, Poland. It was titled 1989, 10 Years Later. About 100 people, mostly high government officials and high-ranking political officials from Eastern and Central Europe whom had been under communist tyranny 10 years before. It was fascinating. The first day, I loved it, the president of Latvia brought out his laptop computer to take notes during the discussions. It was in Gdansk because that's where Solidarity had begun. We laid a wreath at the shipyards one day, and the last night, the president of Poland had a dinner for about 20 of us. And the president of Latvia stood up, and he raised his glass and turned toward the president of Solidarity. He said, "I want to toast you, because when I was a freedom fighter at home, I'd get back to my one-room apartment and take a transistor radio and go from one corner to another of my one-room apartment trying to pick up Radio Free Europe. And I'd listen to the heroic efforts of the brave men and women of Solidarity, and it gave me strength to carry on. It gave me courage. Our cause was just. It helped lead me to the freedom we have today." The president of Solidarity, who was there, stood up, and he turned to me, knowing I'd worked on Reagan's senior staff, and he said, "We too had dark days. We too were discouraged. We too at night listened to Radio Free Europe. And we all could say the following because we memorized it. We memorized what we heard from Ronald Reagan at Westminster. The ultimate determinant in the struggle that's now going on in the world will not be bombs and rockets, but a test of wills and ideas, a trial of spiritual resolve, the values we hold, the beliefs we cherish, the ideals to which we are dedicated." That's what America was founded on. That's what Ronald Reagan helped us rediscover, and that's what he projected to the world. And with the help of some of the gentlemen up here, his ideas were put into practical instruments to advance freedom. So first let me call on Dick Allen. Richard Allen has a special place in the pantheon of Ronald Reagan. He was experienced foreign policy advisor, going back as far as Richard Nixon's 1968 campaign, served as a key advisor, served at the National Security Council, and importantly, in both 1976 on through 1980, served as the top foreign policy advisor to Governor Ronald Reagan. I first met him in the 76 campaign. He was very tolerant of someone who was young, inexperienced, and stupid, and I learned a few things. After he left President Reagan's national security advisor, he was at the Republican Party as a special advisor who helped form the involvement that he and Frank will address later. He has association with the Hoover Institute, and really along with Ed Meese and Marty Anderson, Dick Allen is the other leg of the stool for Ronald Reagan in those two campaigns. It's a great privilege for me personally to have Dick here and to introduce him. Thanks very much. Please go ahead.
Thank you very much, Rich. Thanks, Ambassador Holliday, and thanks to Lauren Craner and IRI, and I'm honored and delighted to be here with IRI on this event. I think I need to put a little postscript on the remark that Rich made about the Iranians fearing President Reagan. Ed will remember this very well. During the transition period, while Carter was in the dumps and trying to get out of the White House and the Reagan transition team was active, there developed a very macabre joke that went something like this: "What's flat and glows in the dark?" And the person would say, "I don't know." And the answer was Tehran, the day after Reagan's inauguration. Well, I passed that on to the president-elect, and he said, he said, "That's pretty good. Why don't you just pass that along?" So we did. We continued to pass that along over a long period of time. Rich mentioned that he was at a conference recently. About 18 months ago, I flew up from New Zealand to Italy for a conference sponsored by Gorbachev and found myself there in the company of about 175 old communists from both sides of the Iron Curtain and about 2 people from the other side, that is, our side. And it was interesting because it wasn't until the second day when I had the opportunity to speak and deliver my paper that the name Ronald Reagan in connection with winning the Cold War was even mentioned. Very instructive was that little plaque that President Reagan put on his desk on the first day in office. He didn't call anyone's attention to it, but Ed would have seen it at 8:30 in the morning. I saw it shortly after 9. It was a little brass plaque, a little hokey brass plaque out there on the front of the desk where you sit facing the president. And it said, "There's no limit to what a man can achieve or how far he can go as long as he doesn't mind who gets the credit." And I think Ronald Reagan would probably think that we're a little over the top here today with the Westminster speech, because the entry from his diary on June 11th, 1982 starts out this way: "Flew out for London and helicoptered to Windsor Castle. This was a fairy tale experience. Black tie dinner with Queen and Prince, the Queen Mother and others. The next day a ride with the Queen. Nancy and the Prince did a carriage of 4 horses. We then left for London. I addressed joint session of Parliament. First Prez ever to do so." That's it. So he didn't think all that much of his own speech, but that would be very typical. Well, by now it's really clear that there will forever be appraisals and reappraisals of Ronald Reagan's approach to the presidency and his 8 years in office. The growing body of scholarly literature, augmented by personal accounts, by biographies, oral histories, and most important, the publication of the president's own diaries, albeit in abridged form for the moment, is ample evidence to the complex but enormous impact he has had on the life of the nation. Many who dismissed Ronald Reagan have now taken a second look and seen something quite different and quite important. If we look at the recently published volume on Presidential Courage by Michael Beschloss, we'll see that he's undertaken a fundamental revision. Or look at the work of perhaps the leading historian of the Cold War, John Lewis Gaddis, in his 2005 book, The Cold War, A New History, and we'll detect what scholars would deem a very substantial reassessment indeed. Nor would Douglas Brinkley, chosen to edit the recently released Reagan diaries, have been able, or perhaps even willing, to write such a generous introduction as he did 10 years ago. It's also been the work of Reaganauts Martin and Annalise Anderson and Kyron Skinner in producing volumes such as Revolution, in Marty's own name, Reagan in His Own Hand, and Reagan, A Life in Letters. All of this has uncovered a veritable treasure trove of early Reagan thinking that has had a profound impact on all issues, domestic and international, in his administration. Apart from a deep love of country and a profound respect for the Constitution, No theme in the writings and musings of Ronald Reagan appears more often than that of the blessings that freedom and democracy bestow upon any nation. Let's keep the context in the political realm. In the 1976 primary race, we saw its beginnings only when Ronald Reagan took up the issue of our deteriorating national security posture. The 1976 Republican platform was a difficult one to achieve. Although privately supporting President Reagan over President Ford, I should say then Governor Reagan, I was asked to draft the national security and foreign policy planks. This became a Reagan platform, which caused the Ford campaign to murder the platform in its crib. It never even saw the light of day, was never even printed and distributed by the Republican National Committee. In early 1977, I visited Governor Reagan at his home in Pacific Palisades just days after Carter's inauguration. I intended to ask him for a personal favor to come to New Jersey to support something that I was interested in. He said he had the entire day, and would I like to talk about foreign policy? And yes, of course. He'd come to New Jersey and write letters on my behalf. But would you like to talk about national security? And I said, yes, sir. So we spoke for 5 or 6 hours that day. When it came time for me to leave for the airport, he said he'd just like to sum up. He said that there's a big difference between being simplistic, as some people would deem me, and having simple answers to complex problems. I nodded, yes, of course. Then he said he wanted to share his theory of the Cold War. And he went on to say just this: well, my theory of the Cold War is that we win and they lose. What do you think of that? Many years would pass before I revealed the locus and the origin of that remark, but I was proud that I did. It was 30 years ago now. I asked him, Governor, do you believe that? And he said, of course I believe it. I just said it. And my only response was something to the effect of, well, Governor, I don't have a faintest idea of whether you intend to run for president of the United States again, but if you do, I'd sure like to help. Over the course of the next several years, Reagan's 5-day-a-week national radio broadcast put him and his views squarely in front of millions of people. Just as back in the 1950s, when I was a student at Notre Dame, I made it a point to be in the car when Paul Harvey did his 5-minute show. And just as there are people today who will schedule their drive to listen to Rush Limbaugh, so too did people take time to listen to Ronald Reagan in the 1970s. Reagan undertook international travel in 1978 in obvious preparation for what was to come. Yet I didn't know that he would run for president in the year of 1980. We traveled to Japan, Taiwan. He went on to Iran, and later in that year to the United Kingdom, where he was refused a meeting by British Prime Minister Callaghan, but he was given the opportunity to meet backbencher Margaret Thatcher. To Paris, where President Valéry Giscard d'Estaing and Premier Raymond Barre declined to meet him and instead directed us to a third-level functionary at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. And finally to Germany, which, oddly enough, by 1978, he had never visited. In Germany, he met with Chancellor Helmut Schmidt, with the leader of the Free Democrats, in Munich with Franz Josef Strauss of the CSU, and then in Berlin, he went to the Wall. Peter Hannaford and I and our wives were with the Reagans, and he stood there. After a long, long moment, with jaw clenched, he turned and said in a very distinct tone in that day of November 1978, we have to find a way to knock this thing down. 9 years later, he had that chance as president to amplify those remarks and implore Gorbachev to tear down the wall. The citizens of West and East Germany did the actual job of demolition. Let's keep it in context for the struggle for the presidency in 1980. Reagan had to run hard against Ford, focusing most of his fire on what he considered to be a failed policy toward the Soviet Union in 1976. But by 1980, Reagan understood the difference between détente, meaning the relaxation of tensions, as a tactic, and détente as a strange new theology that had been elaborated during the Nixon and Ford administrations. Basically, that latter-day version of détente was based on the gloomy assessment that the United States and the Soviet Union were locked in a hopeless, long-term struggle and could not be won in any meaningful way. That therefore, Given the continuing ascendancy and the durability of the Soviet regime, the best we could hope for would be some sort of deal, making it on the terms of long-term peaceful coexistence, also based upon slowly making the Soviet Union dependent upon us and our technological superiority. This would be done by a series of agreements which, if violated, would result in our decision to shut off the flow of trade and technology. Thus, the Soviets would obviously regulate their behavior accordingly and behave properly so as to preserve the maximum benefits. Coupled with his belief that the doctrine of mutual assured destruction, or MAD, was fundamentally immoral because it did not actually reduce the spread of weapons of mass destruction, Reagan denounced the theory of détente as feckless and counterproductive. In a sense, then, while running against Carter in 1980, Reagan was running just as hard against the Nixon-Ford-Kissinger theory of détente. In 1976, the creation of the Committee on the Present Danger made it possible for him to absorb and meet with many Democrats of leading stature. They came one by one to meet with Reagan, and in the long run, eventually supported his candidacy, denying themselves as an important intellectual resource to Jimmy Carter. In addition, working with Peter Hannaford, Lim Nosviger, and others, during that campaign, we ensured that the major foreign policy and national security speeches laid out basic long-range objectives. The speeches were delivered beginning in 1978 and periodically in 1979, giving a true basis of foreign policy statements to provide to the press and the critical reading public. There would be no doubt as to his position on the issues. For the 1980 campaign, we created a formidable array of talent in 2 advisory groups, both domestic and foreign. Among the groups in foreign policy and national security, we had 120 people, and Marty Anderson had approximately 100 in his group. We shouldn't forget the fact that there was a primary season among candidates in 1980, but by the early spring, it was evident that all but one would leave the race gracefully, acknowledging Reagan as the inevitable nominee. The platform that year was to be different, though, a thoroughgoing Reagan document in every respect, bearing the simple title, Family, Neighborhood, Work, Peace, and Freedom. Every single speech of every single statement of the 1980 campaign was measured against those 5 basic strategic themes. It was, if you will, some ground rules for governance. Once in office, no one should have been surprised that Ronald Reagan would have continued precisely as he did in the lead-up to assuming the presidency. And so it was to be not SALT, not strategic arms limitation, but START, strategic arms reduction. I close on this little vignette. For his very first press conference, the senior staff ran 2 murder boards in the cabinet room, sessions in which the staff would ask the nastiest conceivable questions and demand answers, just like Sam Donaldson would from the front row. Over and over, we attempted to provoke a harsh statement without much success. The press conference itself then took place in the East Room of the White House. Somehow, whether in or out of context, the president took advantage of an opportunity to say that the Soviets reserve the right to lie and cheat to get whatever they want. An astonished collective gasp went up among the press corps. When the press conference was over, some reporters rushed over for their phones, others rushed to Al Haig. He and I were standing together, and when the president uttered that remark, good old Al simply rolled his eyes and dropped his jaw, a fine come hither sign to the press to come visit with him afterwards. I followed the president out onto the colonnade on his way back to the Oval Office, about 5 paces behind him. He couldn't have known that I was there. Midway down the colonnade, he turned and said, "Say, Dick, the Soviets, they do lie and cheat to get what they want, don't they?" I could see the smile on his face, the eyebrow arched, and I said, "They sure do, Mr. President." He winked, turned, and said, "I thought so," and continued on to the Oval Office.
Thank you, Dick. I made one mistake earlier, and I want to correct it. A friend of all of ours, a man who served in many high positions in many administrations, including Secretary of the Navy and under Ronald Reagan as the ambassador to the Organization of American States is with us, and a good friend of all of ours, Bill Mittendorf. I should have acknowledged you, Bill. I'm sorry. Next, I'm going to call on Frank Fahrenkopf. I first met him when he was the Republican chairman in Nevada. He came to Washington in 1982, in November, I think, is when we had that Saturday lunch over at the White House, when we gave you the opportunity to serve. And Dick did a great job. Frank did a great job as RNC chairman. It's not an easy job when your administration has the White House, because you always have some tension, and of course, the White House has the man, so they win every argument. But Frank did a great job not only in helping advance the president's political agenda from the RNC, but really made a historic contribution to implementing Ronald Reagan's vision from Westminster. He became very active in the International Democratic Union. He worked with his Democratic counterpart, DNC Chair Kirk, to help set up the National Endowment of Democracy, IRI, NDI. And he'll have insights and experiences that no one else has. So I'm delighted he's here. And also, Frank has been a long-time board member of IRI and does a terrific job there as well. Frank, please.
Thank you. It's also a great pleasure for me to be here today and to really be in the presence of two of my professors. One who actually was a classroom professor of mine, Ed Neese, taught me a course in 1964 at the University of California Law School, Bolt Hall, way back when he was a deputy district attorney in Alameda County, working for the DA, Lowell Jensen, who later came to Washington to work in the Justice Department for Ed. The other professor, and I think it's an adequate and accurate way to describe him, is Dick Allen. Because Dick became my advisor on international matters at the RNC. And we traveled around the world together, including getting stoned by the Greens with Helmut Kohl and George Herbert Walker Bush in Germany. And I learned so much from Dick, and he's been an advisor of mine. And I'm very candid to say probably the best that I've ever had, particularly in foreign policy. So Dick, it's a pleasure to be with you. It's hard to believe that politics was involved in all of this, the creation of what we're talking about here, but it was. In 1981, I was the chairman of all the Republican chairmen. I was not national chairman. I was the chairman of all the state chairmen in the country. And I was tasked with being involved in the international operations that the RNC was going to get involved in. And you might say, well, why would there be a problem? There was a hell of a big problem. Many, many members of the Republican National Committee could not understand why the RNC should be involved in any international matters. Because number one, our purpose was to elect people to office in this country. And many people felt it would be a real waste of our resources to be involved in any way with these sort of operations. So I was tasked with being involved in really two initiatives. Rich mentioned them in passing, but they were really intertwined. And I'm talking about the International Democrat Union, as well as the creation eventually of NED and the Republican Democrat Chamber and Labor Institutes. For me, it started in the summer of 1981, when the Republican Party was invited to send some observers to a meeting in Munich of the European Democrat Union, an organization of center and right-of-center political parties that Margaret Thatcher had really pushed in the late 70s. And the EDU was meeting in Munich, and we were invited to come and observe what was going on. On that delegation was Fred Biebel, who was the deputy chairman of the Republican National Committee and worked with Dick and I over the years when he was there in our international operations. There was a woman by the name of Betty Heitman, who Judy Van Ress will remember, who was the co-chairman of the Republican National Committee at that time. Ed Rollins, who then worked in the political shop at the White House, and a wonderful man. Most Republicans in that era always loved and respected him as long as he lived. That was F. Clifton White. Cliff White, who many people don't realize, was the man really responsible for the creation of IFAS. Cliff walked into my office one day when I was chairman and said, I need two things from you. I need money to get IFAS started, and number two, I need a Democrat to be the co-chairman with me. And I couldn't say no to Cliff. I gave him the money, and I gave him Chuck Manette. And it was actually Chuck Manette who was involved in the NED organization, not Paul Kirk. And he went on to create IFAS, which has been just a tremendous organization all these years. But after that meeting, Ed Rollins and I went to Bonn. And we went to Bonn to meet with Helmut Kohl, who at that time was not chancellor, what was the leader of the CDU, and to visit the Adenauer Stiftung. Because anyone who has studied the history know that part of the seminal planning of what eventually led to NED and what the president was talking about in his speech was that the German Stiftungs had been created after the war, that they were funded by direct payments from the government, each of them representing the political parties, and they were out around the world starting work in democracy. And Ed and I went, spent a whole day at the Adenauer Stiftung. I mean, we came back realizing that there was no way that that was ever going to fly here in the United States, the same way it was done then. But we came back to report on what was being done, and Ed, of course, made his appropriate reports at the White House. Also, by the way, interestingly enough, at that meeting in Munich of the EDU was a man by the name of Sir James Spicer. And Jim Spicer went on to be one of the founding members of the Westminister Foundation that emulated what we were doing in this country with the creation of NED, so that the Brits had their own National Endowment for Democracy, if you will. Now, the report that we made back and the additional work that Dick and others were doing, of course, as you know, led to the creation, those of you who followed, first of the American Political Foundation, which really was created by Bill Brock and by Chuck Manette, and a man who really was also very involved in the early years, George Agree, who I haven't seen or heard from George. I hope he's still alive. I don't know where he is, because he was really instrumental back in the late 70s of getting things moving. And out of the American Political Foundation, which the president referred to in his speech, came what we called the Democracy Project. And the Democracy Project, I was a member, Manette was a member, Brock was a member, and with the tremendous political leadership of a Democratic congressman by the name of Dante Fascell from Florida, who had really come up with the idea earlier in the decade, actually introduced legislation to create something like NED. It never went anywhere, but it started the seminal thinking on the Hill. And as a result of the recommendation of that Democracy Project, it was to create the National Endowment for Democracy, and also with the 4 core grantees from the 2 political parties, Organized Labor and the Chamber of Commerce. Now, there's some very significant dates. I went back and checked them. On April 28, 1983, the National Republican Institute for International Affairs was created. I was its first chairman, and 2 people who worked at the RNC, Fred Biebel and Bill Phillips, who was my chief of staff, were the original organizers of that entity. Later, you might be interested that when we filled out the board consisted of myself as chairman. We put Bob Lagomasino, President Reagan's congressman from the district where the ranch was, from California, was the vice chairman. Fred Biebel, Dick Allen, Ed Rollins, David Norcross was the general counsel, Nelda Barton, who was a national committee woman from Kentucky, Drew Lewis, who went on to be the Secretary of Transportation, Dick Lugar was our senior advisor, Jack Kemp, Bill Phillips, Noel Gross from Pennsylvania, and Bob Carter from the District of Columbia was the initial board when we put it together in December of 1983. Also, shortly thereafter, the IDU was created. Dick had gone the year before to Japan for the creation of the Pacific Democrat Union. For us to join with the EDU to create the IDU, there had to be something that would join together. And he went to Japan. I think Fred was along, and Betty maybe on that meeting when you went. But on June 24th, 1983, Dick and I, along with George Herbert Walker Bush, Vice President of the United States, went to London for the organizational meeting of the International Democrat Union. Margaret Thatcher hosted us. Just to give you some idea of who was at that meeting, I kind of went through this, I've forgotten. Alois Mock, who became the first chairman of the IDU and went on to become the Prime Minister of Austria, was there. Prime Minister Franz Joseph Strauss from the CSU. Helmut Kohl, who was then Chancellor. Jacques Chirac. Andrew Peacock was there from Australia. Prime Minister Paul Schuler, I can never remember, Schluter, I guess his name was, from Denmark. Kari Vellach, the Prime Minister of Norway, who went on to become the second chairman, along with Vice President Bush, and we put together the organization of the IDU. So this was all happening together with the party involvement. Then, interestingly enough, after we created the IDU, what we called then the National Republican Institute for International Affairs, its name was later changed to IRI. We had some real concern as to whether or not it was going to survive. And so, as a sidebar, Ed Meese, Lynn Nofziger, Dick and I and Fred Beeble created something, I don't know if you still remember this, Dick. It was called the National Republican International Cooperation Fund. We were creating an entity that was going to carry forth President Reagan's vision in case the Ned bill, which there were a lot of peoples on both sides of the aisle who were opposing, wasn't to make it through. We actually opened up offices on Indiana Avenue, I think it was, and I think we had one of Lynn's old secretaries who we put in place there with Keith Schuette, who was very instrumental in those days. He'd come over from the State Department and eventually became the first president of IRI. But then on November 17th, 1983, after great acrimony in Congress, the conference report was agreed to, and it was clear that the NED would come into creation. We later, as I said, changed the name of the National Republican Institute for International Affairs. Its name should have been changed from the very beginning, but that's one of the reasons we did. We called it IRI. So what was happening here was that as a result of that speech, the Republican Party was on divergent views from the standpoint of where we were going to go internationally with regard to like-minded political parties. And the IDU still exists to this day. John Howard, the current Prime Minister of Australia, is the chairman. It does tremendous work. We're trying to get it reinvigorated, to be very candid with you. What happened to the IDU is, Dick will remember, when the wall fell, most of those European parties who were so very much involved turned east and started working with those democracies, new democracies that came out of those Iron Curtain countries, and they sort of lost interest. We're now involved in getting it re-energized. We then went on with the creation of NED. Although we've survived, in fact, I won't embarrass him by mentioning his name, but we survived actually by one vote in the United States Senate. A senator voted against the motion, but he didn't realize by doing so he was voting for it, and we survived. By a wrong vote, we survived by one vote, and the National Endowment for Democracy went on and was created. Chuck Manat, I, Lane Kirkland, representing the AFL-CIO, and Jay Van Andel of the original Amway Company represented the Chamber of Commerce. And we were the first 4 founding members of NED that were on that board for 10 years, and then we were term limited. Then I came back out and joined IRI. So there was an awful lot of politics involved in all of this. The goal was, with both of these organizations, to carry through on Ronald Reagan's speech what his goal was. And I can't be any prouder of where we are today with IRI and I'm sure that the late president, were he here today, would say to Lauren and the staff, a job well done. Thank you.
Thank you, Frank. I'd like to now introduce Ambassador Michael Samuels. He had been ambassador in Sierra Leone. He served as a deputy of the United States Trade Representative. But the particular thing why we're lucky to have him here today is he wrote in 1981 in the Washington Quarterly an article with Bill Brock dealing with the concept of public-private institute to support students, culture, and labor abroad to spread American values. He has a unique perspective both in how it was put together, the ideas, and the role the business groups have had in making the Reagan Doctrine and the democracy agenda come alive. Thank you.
Thank you, Rich, and thank you from IRI for putting this together. It will give you all an opportunity to pick little patches and figure out how the entire quilt was created, because each of us has our own perspective on this, and I'm really honored to have been asked to provide mine. Actually, I tried to think of a theme, a title or something for what I was going to say, and it is Filling an Empty Democracy Basket. By education and training and maybe by constitution, I'm a historian, and one of the things I love is trying to recreate history, and what you are helping do now is to do precisely that, because each of us has our own perspective on the piece of history that we're familiar with, and you're getting several of those today, and I'm glad that you've included me to add a little bit to trying to figure out what the reality really was that related to the creation of the net. What led to the situation that was faced by Reagan and others in the 1980s? Well, it started after World War II with a series of very well-conceived and helpful CIA projects and activities, largely in Europe, that were aimed at trying to counter the Soviet Union. The types of activities that were supported were broad-based, liberal, conservative, right, left, the kinds of things that today we might refer to as civil society, but in those days that phrase didn't exist. It has been created since the NED was created. But in the case of the U.S., why the CIA? It was for two reasons. One is because the U.S. was afraid of transparency in letting the world know what we were doing. And secondly, because there wasn't enough support in the Congress for this kind of activity that could ever have gotten it funded had it been done overtly during that period of time. Well, that all came crashing down in the late 1960s, largely a result of a series of articles that appeared in a magazine called Ramparts in the era of Vietnam, and that led to expanded paranoia about what the U.S.'s role was, people, including chairmen of important committees, referring to U.S. behavior as arrogance, and really led to a major self-consciousness domestically against a bunch of previous programs, so that we basically stopped doing this kind of thing. And the big event that highlighted what we weren't doing was the Portuguese Revolution of 1974. You may recall that prior to that time, the Portuguese had been led for quite some time by a somewhat, in some cases, very dictatorial regime, continued with an insistence of continuing its own colonial activities, which it referred to as overseas provinces. But the Revolution of '74 was a reaction to dictatorship, a reaction to the failure of both colonialism and the war to try to keep the colonies. And the Western world found a Western ally, a NATO ally, about to move leftward because the only organized bodies of a political nature in Portugal were the communists and the socialists. The U.S. was very worried about this. Kissinger was extremely concerned about this. And what could the U.S. do about it? And the answer basically was nothing, except to encourage the German Stiftung to try to get active in Portugal. Personally, I have suspected, I don't know, I haven't really followed very much, but I suspected that the CIA actually helped fund some of those Stiftung activities. But in fact, they helped develop Portugal in a direction that led to a multi-party, non-communist democracy that evolved. Well, the U.S. had a serious foreign policy conundrum during this period. Almost all U.S. bilateral policies, particularly toward developing countries, used democracy to reflect what it is we were interested in. However, neither USAID nor the State Department was doing anything to try to further democracy. They were afraid to. The Congress wasn't willing to support it. So democracy had become, in U.S. foreign policy, during the 70s in particular, only a slogan. Nothing allowed us to perform anything related to democracy. Until the Reagan era, talk about democracy was almost only in the world of ideas. As Frank mentioned, Dante Fascell, a congressman from Florida, was really the first one in Congress to speak about this, to beat the drum about this, and try to get people interested in this. Organized labor was very interested because many of its activities had been supported by the CIA in the 40s and 50s, and they felt a shortage of funding. And Lane Kirkland realized that very much, and he argued very hard for this kind of activities. There were a few others active, including some in the State Department, who realized the absence of substance to some of the policies of the U.S. government in that era. I had a funny vantage point myself at that time. I had been in the State Department, I'd been an ambassador to a developing country, and I saw what we were not doing. After I left the State Department, I went to the Center for Strategic and International Studies, where I dealt with third world countries, and I had a fairly broad mandate to do pretty much what I could get funded. One of the things I was interested in was this democracy deficit in our own policies. In 1981, I moved to the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, and I took this interest with me, even though it was not something that the Chamber was particularly interested in. And I started a series of breakfasts with people who I felt reflected an interest in this subject. And among the people who attended these breakfasts from time to time were Bill Brock, a guy named Bill Douglas from Labor, who actually had some good ideas in this area, someone from within the U.S. government named Walt Roberts, another guy named Mark Palmer, Dante Fascell from time to time, George Agri came to it from time to time, John Richardson, who later became the first president of the NED, and at the time was at Freedom House, and I had known him from earlier days at the State Department. He came, and miscellaneous people would come from time to time. And this process was going on from 81 through 82, and we would meet and we'd talk, and who knows what went on afterwards. But the administration, moving in its own Reagan direction, and including some of the people who attended some of these breakfasts, moved forward, and thus the speech. But what about after the speech? How would one implement these new ideas? Recommendations had to come forward. There wasn't a lot of cheering for new U.S. government policies in this area. And it was a struggle, but eventually this thing called the Democracy Program, which was really a study group that was to make recommendations, that was created after they finally found some funding for it. What were the directions that came out of this democracy program, which, in my view, was one of the more interesting exercises I ever participated in? I'm really pleased that I was able to be part of it. First of all, it reflected the view that conducting democracy programs was not to be directly the role of government agencies. It had to be something that was freed from control, the traditional control over purse strings. But still, it would depend on government money. Clearly, party building was important, but it was only one part of the undertaking. Nobody ever looked at this as what is now referred to as democracy promotion. And I'll make another comment on that subject later. It wasn't promoting democracy, it was building democracy. Trying to build the institutions from which individual countries with their own cultural backgrounds and histories could develop their own democracies. Additionally, this was not viewed through some kind of human rights lens. In fact, in the early 80s, there had been extremely negative reaction to the human rights agenda of the Carter administration, and the Reagan administration came in not wanting to replicate in any way whatsoever what had happened in the Carter administration. And thus you have democracy and human rights kind of viewed in different boxes at this time. But what eventually emerged was the centrality of four pillars: the two parties, labor, business, and the net itself would conduct its own programs, funding what we referred to at the time as the minnows. Journalism, a whole bunch of things that were literally a lot bigger than minnows, but nonetheless, they were viewed at the time in the parlance of the day as the minnows. Let me just briefly make a comment on the role of business. It was pure chance that I happened to be part of this whole process and an employee of the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. The inclusion of business was not a given. It was not necessarily in the thought process of most people who talked about and thought about democracy of the day. Furthermore, there was close to no interest amongst U.S. corporations or amongst business trade associations to be part of this exercise at the time. There was some political desire on some part to balance off labor, and there was some feeling by some of the others that in order to get total support, or at least enough support to pass this, you couldn't possibly have labor alone being funded and business not being funded. But this wasn't necessarily accepted within my place of employment, the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. Ironically, there were many more people on the staff and the senior staff of the Chamber who were opposed to this idea than were in favor of it. They were opposed for a number of reasons. One was that the major policy direction of the Chamber in those days was reduce government spending. How then can the Chamber be on the receiving end of government monies if we're talking about reducing government spending? Furthermore, at that time, much of the leadership of the Chamber was opposed to much international activity by the Chamber at all. They saw that as peripheral to the role of the Business Trade Association, and in fact, those of us who were trying to pursue the international side of the Chamber were constantly moving uphill. It was all saved by the then president of the Chamber, Richard Lesher, who had a vision and had a strategy and saw it as something, as a way for business to fit importantly into national policy. And particularly with the Reagan imprimatur on the entire idea, it became something that Lesher pushed forward. Well, I've given you a bit of the history as I have seen it, and let me make two personal observations. I'd referred to one of them before. I strongly feel that there has been a mistake that has been perpetrated up till now, and it continues to be by the administration, and even by the net itself, in talking about the idea of democracy promotion. It sounds like something that some PR firm is doing. I think it misjudges the cultural and other difficulties of the entire process. And frankly, it makes it look as if it's a U.S. thing. And I think it's a mistake. I think people should eliminate the word promotion when they're talking about this exercise and talk about democracy building. And secondly, looking at this, and I've spent much of my life dealing with developing countries in different parts of the world, expecting positive movement in many cultures in the direction of democracy in short-term bursts is a mistake. It's a long-term exercise. It's a vital exercise. I'm glad that it has lasted now for over 2 decades, and I sure hope it lasts for another 5 or more. Thank you again to IRI for doing this and for including me. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Our final panelist has been a centurion in the battle to spread democracy for a long time, a Foreign Service officer who had a keen interest from his own life experience as an FSO on the importance of spreading freedom and democracy. He drew on his experience to help develop the substance of the speech given in Westminster. He met with Bill Brock, Michael Samuels, and others. He came up with the concept of creating democracy-building organizations. Later, as ambassador in Hungary, he was in the front lines in doing that, in reaching out to dissidents, to encouraging those who had been in the shadow of communism to prepare when there'd be an opportunity for freedom to spread. He's the author of a book I would recommend to any of you interested in the effort to build democracy. It's called Breaking the Real Axis of Evil. It's an excellent read with some fundamental ideas. He continues as vice chairman of the Freedom House and a good friend of many of ours. Thanks so much for being here, Mark. Mark Palmer.
Rich and Lauren, thank you for doing this today. As viewed from the State Department, where I was working at the time, Ronald Reagan was seen as a radical. He had radical ideas in a field drowning then and still in a morass of conventional wisdom. Foreign policy was supposed to be about maintaining stability, not about encouraging change. But Ronald Reagan believed that radical change was essential, and particularly with regard to the Soviet Union. He knew that we were not just in an arms race, but in a war of ideas. In many parts of the world, even in the West, people then assumed that socialism was the future. And this assumption had clear and devastating consequences for American interests. His great gift and a purpose of this speech was to change that assumption, to proclaim and demonstrate that democracy and free enterprise were the future, and thereby to change the course of history. In the spring of 1982, Secretary Haig and Undersecretary Eagleberger told me that the President was going to Europe and that I should do first drafts of his major speeches, of which there were actually a number. Work with the NSC and the White House on the speeches and travel with the President to help manage the process. I was Eagleberger's deputy for policy, a position which allowed me to work on almost any issue I wanted. While I had been Henry Kissinger's principal speechwriter, I was really a Soviet specialist and, as Rich mentioned, a career Foreign Service officer. I'm trying to say I didn't think of myself as a speechwriter. As usual in my experience, however, with speeches, no one gave me any guidance for the focus of the Westminster address. During this period, I had been the State Department's only participant in Mike's breakfast, which you've now all heard about. And I saw in Westminster the ideal forum for the President to launch these democracy institutions which Dante Fascell, Mike, Bill Brock, and others of us here and elsewhere had been developing. So I made the President's radical idea about the ultimate triumph of democracy the main focus of the first draft, built in these new democracy institutions to get us there, and ran the draft up the NSC and the White House flagpole. I want to just stress that no one in the State Department actually ever read this draft except me, and that was fortunate. Al Haig, this was not his sort of thing at the time. Larry thought I was crazy about these things as a former civil rights type and was perfectly willing to just sort of let me do what I wanted. I think he assumed correctly that Tony Dolan and others in the White House speech writer shop would do their own thing, which of course they significantly did, although I'm proud to say that quite a bit of the stuff is still from my first draft. I heard back that President Reagan was positive, as were my breakfast colleagues who were sworn into secrecy that these things were going to be launched when they were launched. I personally happen to strongly agree with the President's radical vision. Let me quote some more of his words from that speech. The President said, "On one point we are all united, our abhorrence of dictatorship in all its forms." This wasn't just, it's important to remember, this wasn't just a speech against the Soviet Union or Soviet communism. This was a much broader dream that Ronald Reagan had, a much bolder vision. Our abhorrence of democracy in all its forms, for the sake of peace and justice. I want to underline the word peace because at the time, not a lot of people associated democracy and peace. Today, President Bush, our president now, has made that a major theme, but at the time, that connection was not in the academic world, in the literature. President Reagan was early in stressing the connection between democracy and peace. For the sake of peace and justice, let us move toward a world in which all people are at last free to determine their own destiny. The President called for all communist and other dictatorships to be put on the ash heap of history, and expressed his ultimate Californian optimism that, quote, with a global campaign for freedom, strong leadership, time, and a little bit of hope, the forces of good ultimately rally and triumph over evil. My own experience on the ground inside dictatorships had convinced me that this view was right. On trips to the Soviet Union in the early 1960s as a student majoring in Russian affairs, I became convinced that Russian students wanted the same things that I did. One girl told me, one very cute girl told me, I would cut off my right arm for a visit to Paris, London, or New York. By 1982, by the time of the speech, I had spent 8 years as a diplomat in communist countries. The need and potential for change was evident to me, but this was a view shared by few in the foreign policy establishment, except, most importantly, the President of the United States. I was seated next to a member of Parliament when the President spoke. The MP said to me in awe that it was simply incredible that the President could memorize and deliver such an address without a single note. I assured him that the President cared passionately about the subject and failed to point out the then relatively new innovation of invisible from the audience speech prompters. More importantly, I stood near President Reagan when Prime Minister Thatcher came up to congratulate him. She said it was one of the greatest addresses given in that House, and how very much she would like to establish a similar democracy promotion institution in the United Kingdom. It took her and others 8 years to overcome opposition from within the Foreign Office and elsewhere before the Westminster Foundation ultimately made its debut. The birth pains, as we've heard this afternoon, the birth pains of our own democratic institutions were also severe and long-lasting. And these institutions again today face serious challenges, as does the whole democracy-building cause. The immediate reaction from the chattering classes to the speech was universally negative. I can't think of anything positive that was written about the speech. Dismissed as harsh Cold War rhetoric unhelpful to the process of détente, widespread skepticism greeted the President's predictions. But the Soviet Union collapsed, and dictators across the globe have fallen since then, and entire regions have emerged as zones of peace and freedom. It appears enslaved people reacted differently than those who enslaved them. What lessons can we learn from Ronald Reagan and his favorite speech? I understand that when he was interviewed at the end of his presidency, he said this was his favorite speech. First, enlisting our democratic allies in the process of building freedom, as President Reagan did with Margaret Thatcher, is key to our success. We cannot do this alone. Thanks in part to him, democracies now are a majority of the world's nations. with the election of the new French government and a real freedom-fighting foreign minister, we should encourage France and the EU to work more closely with us in building a really viable community of democracies. Second, appealing to people over the heads of their oppressors works. President Reagan was a master of conveying a tough lesson with love. We need to intensify our outreach to the Iranians, Chinese, North Koreans, Egyptians, Pakistanis, Cubans, and others who know that their leaders are corrupt and want inspiration and solidarity from us. Third and finally, huge progress has been achieved since President Reagan set the goal of a world in which all people are free, a world without any dictators. But there are still some 45 dictators around the world, and they remain the main threat to our security. They are, among other things, directly or indirectly at the root of terrorism and creating a massive new threatening model of authoritarian capitalism. Hu Jintao, Putin, Khamenei, Kim Jong-il, Mubarak, Musharraf, Mugabe, King Abdullah must give way to Democrats for Ronald Reagan's legacy of peace and justice to be fully realized. And that is precisely why IRI remains so important in ultimately achieving the goal of his speech. Thank you all.
Thank you very much, Mark. Thank you. I think from the remarks that have been made and from your own knowledge, you share with us a sense of Ronald Reagan's success driven by deep conviction, a realization of the importance to articulate a narrative of that dream, his consistent interest in bringing people together, getting allies to join in important missions, a recognition that practical instruments had to be created to advance that effort, delegation to attentive, competent, and persistent people, like the people on this panel with me today, who helped realize that goal, and the unfailing ability of Ronald Reagan to tap the optimism, hope, and promise of the American people. I'd like to ask one question to the panelists now, and it's something that Mark and I have talked about in various venues, but I think it's important to us as we give testament to Ronald Reagan's important role in the value of this speech. Democracy building is less popular today than it was yesterday. There have been setbacks in Lebanon, Ukraine, Belarus, Kazakhstan, and Iraq. It's going to be important for those who are part of the democracy business, those part of the community that feel this is important, to reflect on how to re-energize this process so that we can advance the legacy of Ronald Reagan and the dream of our founding fathers. So I'd like to start in the same order that we went through and allow Dick, then Frank, then our others to have an opportunity to comment on that. I don't expect any simple answer, but I think we'd get some informed observations that might help us. Thank you. Dick?
Well, I would point to an obstacle that seems to have invaded our political discourse to the extent that we still have civilized discourse, and that is the growth of partisanship. Whether by generosity or simply because of the press at time, Frank Fahrenkopf neglected to mention that when we went to London that summer, we had another person along named Chuck Manat, who was the former chairman of the Democratic National Committee, and we were dead set on getting the Democrats into what would be created in London, the International Democrat Union. Made good sense. And by the way, the name was perfect for a bunch of right-wing crazy Republicans. International? Oh, bad. Huh? Democrat? Really bad. Huh? And Union? Terrible. Think about that. So, International Democrat Union, we were taking the nomenclature, because words do have meaning here, and we were applying it to ourselves, and this was to be a group of moderate and conservative, freedom-loving parties throughout the world. So we put strong pressure on Chuck and even got him up close to Mrs. Thatcher, as I recall, and it just didn't work. It didn't work. They couldn't be seen in this episode. Well, that was then. Now, mention was made here of great members of Congress who did step across the aisle. And we still need to recreate that basis, it seems to me, to construct this civilized dialogue about what could be done on a joint basis. We don't have too many of the members of the past who could do that. And I, for one, would volunteer whatever we can to see if we can't recreate that basis of respectable discourse between the parties.
Thank you, Dick. Frank?
You really reminded me of something. One of the reasons that the Democrats didn't come in is when Dick and I walked into that room, who was seated at the table next to Helmut Kohl but one Robert Strauss, the former chairman of the Democratic National Committee, and Chuck Manette went through the roof. That's right. Because
That's right.
They didn't get along, and Strauss was an old buddy of Helmut Kohl's, and Kohl had dragged him along. In fact, I had to leave with Manette, take him down the street, so we could have a cigarette and a drink to calm him down. Because
2 drinks.
2 drinks. So
that means that the Democrats have as much trouble as the Republicans to play nice with children.
That's true. One of the things that came out of, again, this joint international endeavors with the IDU was that we also, many of the programs that we were attempting to use the IRI and the Dems were trying to do, this was an alliance, not of countries, but an alliance of center and right-of-center political parties, and we worked together to achieve a sense of what was going on in these other nations, whether in their parliaments, because most of them were, of course, parliamentary forms of government. Very close relationships were brought up. The lesson, I think, and the lesson of Iraq is we can't do it alone. There has to be coalitions built, other nations, so that when we're trying to go into a nation, wherever it may be, to promote democracy, if it's just the U.S., it ain't going to happen. Even if we have some help from Great Britain, we have to put together those coalitions. Now, as I mentioned, the IDU sort of fell apart. But actually, in this town, next week, there are members of the Tory party. In fact, the shadow defense minister and I have been working to reinstitute something that they have labeled, and Mrs. Thatcher is supporting, called the Atlantic Bridge, to reestablish the relationship between the parties to try to develop in Congress, among Republicans, and in Parliament support for this. It was a very strong relationship during the 80s. I mean, Mrs. Thatcher invited me to bring a delegation to Blackpool, the Conservative Party conference. I brought 20 members of the Republican National Committee. We attended that conference in Blackpool. And then we went to London and we spent 3 days and we lived in the houses of members of Parliament, Tory members. There was a very close working relationship. I think that's the sort of coalition that we've got to get back at trying to put together. And those party members, we get to know each other. They can go to their parliaments and have a political impact. Because if you don't have the political support, it's not going to happen.
Thank you, Frank. Mike?
Well, we live in an era in which we have lost some of our confidence in ourselves. And it's pretty hard when we domestically don't have that confidence to be out promoting what it is we stand for. And I think that we trip over ourselves a bit these days, and hopefully we'll somehow get around that, and the bipartisan approach is extremely important, as Dick has pointed out. We also need to try to help those new democracies succeed. It isn't enough just to be a democracy for a moment. The goal is to keep them there, and that really means economic success. It means transparency. It means dealing with civil rights issues of various kinds in those countries. And that's something that we have to be on the side of in order for the democracies to succeed. One of the current administration's really good initiatives is the creation of this thing called the Millennium Challenge Account, which picks out those countries that are doing the right thing and rewards them and allows them to be even more successful. Now, what that means is that you're left with some countries that aren't successful, where dictatorships continue. And it's going to be that there are going to be some countries that are going to lag. Hopefully, they will see what's happening with the other countries, or at least the people will. And there are going to be some countries where traditions are such that the people will not have a voice. And hopefully, with enough examples of success in the era of the computer, word gets around pretty quickly. And hopefully we'll see revolutions in some of those countries of various sorts. They may not even be ones that we are involved in, but we are if we keep pushing in the world of ideas and keep building those institutions. And I think that's what we should be doing.
Thank you, Mike. Mark?
Well, we're in, of course, crazy season now in this country in terms of the campaigns. And if one examines as Ron Asmus did recently, the Democratic candidates' statements, the word democracy is hard to find. And even, I would say, among the Republican candidates, with the exception of Senator McCain, our chairman, it's not very evident either. So one of the things it seems to me we ought to be trying to do in what I think is an intellectually vapid set of campaigns, both the Republicans and the Democrats, would be to put together some of us who care and understand something about this stuff and try to go talk to the campaigns and say, look, one of you is going to be president, and this is really a critical part of our national security interests. And you've got to commit now to certain things. And one of the things I'd like to try to get people committed to is a real community of democracies. There are 120 countries in the world, if you're generous in your definition of democracy, which are democratic. I mean, we're now a critical mass. We represent, I think, 89% of the world's GNP. Militarily, we're overwhelmingly the most powerful set of nations. But that's not preordained that will always be the case. I mean, the Chinese are coming on now, the Russians, Iran, etc. I mean, it's not clear that forevermore the democracies, will always be the strongest set of nations. And what is really clear is that we don't work together. We have no institution through which we work on a global basis to meet global challenges. And so there is a debate now, fortunately, starting up about what to do, concert of democracies, alliance of democracies, as Senator McCain has talked about. And there is the existing community of democracies, which I've been quite involved in for a long time, and where there's some real progress. There'll be a secretariat in Warsaw, started very soon in the next few months. It's beginning to take a little bit of shape. I think it's still basically a virtual organization, but it's beginning to be something. And the next president and the Congress and all of us who care about this stuff really ought to think through, okay, how do you take it to the next stage? How do the democracies really start to work together on the issues that matter in the world?
Thank you, Mark. I'm going to ask one more question to the panel, then we'll allow one or two questions from the audience. Then my boss, Lauren Craner, says we should move on. And my question goes to something touched upon in the original presentations, but is certainly part of the discussion I just raised. And that is the so-called realist view on the importance of stability and how the democratic agenda fits into it. And I raise it because recent events have brought questions among many of whether building democracy can lead to the sort of enduring relationships, the enduring shared values and stability, or the cost of the disruption to get there. Clearly, there's a variety of ways and means to build democracies, some more successful than others. But I think it would be very worthwhile to hear my four colleagues comment on this issue, especially as we enter this presidential campaign season and look ahead to see where this effort will go in the next few years. Dick?
Well, that raises a a myriad of questions. I reflect on what occurred after President Reagan left office. The wall fell. We were confronted with a brand new period, beginning in the late 80s and well into the 90s, which operated under the rubric of a new world order, but had no flesh on it whatsoever. There was no transitional assistance to be identified. There was a movement to keep the Ukraine inside the Soviet Union. Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia should not depart because it would be destabilizing. Croatia and Slovenia decided to pull out of Yugoslavia, and they were reminded by Republicans and Democrats alike that this would not enhance stability in the region. It was only Helmut Kohl who was able to reach in to make Slovenia and Croatia possible as nations today and ultimately candidates for Western alliances. That was an extremely critical period, and we lost a lot of time there. I think since that time, there's not been any foundation building whatsoever. IDU and all of the other organizations we've talked about here were specifically created to advance ideas and cooperation among like-minded people, like-minded political parties. Today we see the retrogression in Russia, for example. Anyone who thinks that Putin is not recreating czarist repression really needs to take another look at the fundamental documents and the documented evidence that's coming from Russia today. The notion that China, because it's having the Olympics, is liberalizing is another one of the fantasies. In fact, I recommend that anyone who wants a good 112-page read go out and buy James Mann's book called The China Fantasy. It's an evening reading that will reward you greatly for whatever price you pay for it. There are movements of regression underway today, and I don't see that we are capable or willing to encounter them, even with our Republican administration and its alleged devotion to democracy. It's not there. It's not there in Putin's case, and it's not there in China's case, much less in North Korea, which is more or less off the radar screen, a regime so extreme that it simply cannot be described in great detail.
Thank you, Dick, for your soft-spoken, nuanced view, which I happen to share.
With the bark off.
Which I happen to share. Frank.
The fact is, democracy is hard. It's hard. I remember being in Berlin at an IDU meeting with the then Prime Minister of Sweden, Carl Bildt. And we were there about a week before Christmas. And as we walked back from dinner to our hotel, the stores along the main shopping areas in Berlin, outside the windows, you could tell who had come over from the east. The wall was down, had just come down. And you could tell who the East Germans were looking in the window. You could tell from their clothing and their attitude. And as Carl and I walked, I said to him, he says, you know, these people think now that all of this is going to be theirs. But people who have lived under totalitarianism or dictatorship have a very hard time adjusting to the free market. And we have seen that throughout. Who in the world in this audience 8 years ago would ever believe that Daniel Ortega would be back in power in Nicaragua? Retrenchment, as Dick points out, is taking place. And I think where we have failed is to come up with, and Mike mentioned it, this economic support with a new democracy so that those people looking in those windows won't think it's going to be automatic and then become disappointed. And if you're disappointed, retrenchment comes easy.
Mike?
You know, your questions dealt with stability, but stability is relative. If you got a bad place, you don't particularly want stability. If you want to have a good place, you want stability, but you know that there'll be change. You want an ability to people who are frozen out and who have been frozen out for centuries because of class structures or ethnic structures to be able to have an opportunity to move forward. And when they do, that changes stability. In fact, the nature of democracy is such that it figures out ways to channel instability in a positive direction. That's really what you want. And that's what I think we ought to encourage. And let me, if I may, put in a plug for something that is being drowned out now in a number of fronts, and that is open trading systems are important to encourage democracy and the interaction of democracies. And we're in an era where maintaining open trading systems is increasingly difficult. And in our own society, it's very difficult to find the support for expanding open trade. And frankly, it goes, the criticism of open trade goes with the criticism of open politics. And I think this is a dangerous moment.
Thank you. Mark?
The great intelligence failure of the last 40 years, in my judgment, has been on this issue of stability. There have been 60 peaceful democratic revolutions in the last 40 years, 60. And if you ask yourself, who predicted any of them, the CIA, the State Department, the American press, the academics, the so-called other think tank experts, ask yourself, who predicted any of them? Indonesia, Philippines, Chile, the Soviet Union, any of them. So, when we ask ourselves, looking at the remaining 45 dictatorships, are they stable? I think that's a ridiculous question. They're profoundly unstable because they don't rely on the will of their people. They are, as Gandhi would tell us, if the people would only one day wake up and say, okay, we're going to non-cooperate, they'd all fall because they're all artificial. And they will all fall sooner or later if we play our cards right and help the people inside, who increasingly over the last 40 years have come up with the nerve and the organization to get the bums out. So I think this debate about stability has to be seen in a dynamic way. We have to be after ultimate stability, not the stability of the grave, which is what, unfortunately, I think the foreign policy elite, the intelligence establishment, many of my colleagues in the State Department, the academic community, is still in this mode. It's still the dominant conventional thinking in the foreign policy world.
Mark, thank you. I have been given the hook by this nice lady back here, so I'm going to withdraw my offer to have 2 questions from the floor, but the panelists will be here for the reception. Lauren, is there anything you wish? Thank you all for coming.